All right, important lecture coming at you. We're going to talk about the DAX calculate function. Now, calculate is arguably one of the most important functions of all because not only does it do pretty powerful things on its own, but it also serves as a container for much more sophisticated and complex DAX formulas. So let's break this down. Calculate on its own, it's pretty straightforward. It evaluates an expression or formula under a set of defined filters. Basically, calculate is going to modify our filter context. So here's what it looks like. You've got your expression for the first argument, and this could be the name of a measure, or it could be a DAX formula that could create a valid measure, right? So things like a total orders measure, or you could sum the return quantity column from your returns data table. Both of those are totally valid options. And then the second component of the function is this set of filters, this list of simple Boolean filters, meaning true or false expressions. Now, important thing to note here that these must be simple expressions with fixed values. So we've got our column name on the left, like our country column from the territory lookup or the year column from our calendar lookup, and then some sort of value or text or table expression on the right. And this can be separated by, some sort of operator like equals or greater than, not equal to, less than, etc. All right, so we see some examples here where we're looking at where our country equals USA or our year is not equal to the max year in our calendar table. So both of these are valid cases as part of the calculate filter argument. What you can't do here is insert more complex filters that don't evaluate to a Boolean value. You also can't use filters that reference measures. So pro tip here, the way that I wrap my head around calculate as I learned it for the first time was to really think of it as a function that modifies filters like a sum if or a count if or an average if function in Excel. The difference here is that calculate can evaluate measures based on any sort of calculation, not just sums or counts or averages. So you can almost think of this as like a calculate if, which is much more flexible because you can define really rich, really complex measures and then plug those into expression arguments here in the calculate function. So just thinking of calculate in this way really helped me wrap my head around it for the first time. All right, so let's jump into Power BI and we're going to do a simple demo. And then after that demo, we're going to head back to the slides and we're going to dig a little bit deeper into exactly how this is all working. All right, so we're back in our AdventureWorks report. And let's try creating our first calculate measure ever. And so basically what I want to do here is create a measure that captures bulk orders. So basically I want to evaluate my total orders measure that I've already created, but only under the filter expression where my order quantity is greater than 1, right? So calculate's a good candidate for this. So we'll come back up here on our measure table. We'll right click, add a new measure. And for this measure, we're going to call it bulk orders equals, and then we're going to start typing in calculate. And our first argument here is the expression. So what am I calculating here? That's basically what the expression value is. And well, what I want to do is I want to calculate my total orders measure that I've already defined. So remember our shortcut here, you can click on the square opening bracket to see any measures you've already created. Coming down here to total orders, we'll comma over to our filter expression. And what we're going to use this for is saying, hey, in cases where my order quantity, which is in the sales table, in cases where that's greater than 1, I want to call that a bulk order. All right, so if we start typing in sales data, we get all of the columns within that table, and we can head over to our order quantity. We're going to say in cases where that's greater than 1, we're going to call that bulk orders. And that's it. Now, you might be thinking, hey, order quantities greater than 1 might not be bulk orders, but again, for the sake of this example, that's how we're going to define it. So we'll click enter. We'll lock this in. All right, so we've got our measure locked in. Let's select our matrix here, and we're going to update this a little bit. I'm actually going to pull out, we'll reduce this just to our category name. And then I actually want to update some of the measures here. All right, so we're going to look at total orders, and I'm going to pull out my returns, customers, return rate, and I want to add in quantity sold. right? And then we're also going to now add in our bulk orders measure. All right, and remember too, like if you forget to format anything, you can always click on that measure, head back in, and we're going to update this just so there's a comma in there. All right, so this is looking pretty good, right? And what's interesting here is you can see that we have bulk orders, right, for accessories, which is a pretty decent percentage of our total quantity sold or our total orders. And then also for clothing here, we don't see any bulk orders for bikes, which again, based on how much bikes typically cost, it's likely that people aren't going in and buying multiple bikes at one time. So let's jump back over to the slides, and I want to drill a little bit deeper into exactly how this function is working. So let's look at a slightly different example here. In this case, we've defined a new measure, and we're calling it red sales, which uses calculate to evaluate the quantity sold measure, but only when the product color from the product table is equal to red. And when you visualize this red sales measure against your quantity sold measure broken down by the product color, as you can see here in the matrix, we get something that's kind of interesting in that red sales column. We can see that we have these same values repeating for each product color and even in the total. So what the heck's happening here? So at this point, you may be wondering, hey, shouldn't these cells all have their own separate filter context? I mean, that's what we covered earlier in the course. I would expect that I would see a different sales value for my black and multi and silver product colors. And this actually leads me to a very interesting point, which is that calculate, what it's actually doing here is it's modifying and overruling any competing filter context. Now let that sink in for a minute. Let's pay attention to our product color where it equals black for one instant. That black row in the matrix has the filter context of product color equals black. It's defined by the row label, right? So that's kind of its initial filter context. Our product color equals black. And it also has the filter context for product color equals red, which is coming from our calculate function in our red sales measure. But what's interesting here is that both of those can't be true at the same time. And because of that, the black filter is overwritten by the product color filter from the calculate function. Basically, the calculate function kind of takes priority. So I like to think of calculate as being a bully function or a bully filter. And it says, hey, I don't care where I'm sitting within this matrix or this visual. I don't care what the initial filter context is. I should be calculating product color equals red, regardless of what the row context is here. And that's why you see that same total repeat row after row after row. All right, so at this point, it may be helpful to revisit that step-by-step measure calculation process that we walked through earlier in this section. Right, so remember that there are 3 steps to every measure calculation. It starts with that filter context being detected and applied, right? That's what we call that initial filter context. So in this case, we're looking at product color equals black in that same example. So Power BI says, okay, we're in the black row. The matrix row labels have passed us filter context that says product color should equal black. All right, so go ahead to the product table. Let's filter that down to just the rows where the product color is black. So here's where things change. Before we move on to step 2, where normally that filter context would pass down to any related tables from our product lookup, there's an intermediate step, which is that the filter context gets modified by calculate. So anytime the measure is being evaluated, in this case, red sales contains a calculate function, that filter context gets overwritten right here between steps 1 and 2. So what's happening is that even though we originally filtered down the product table to product color equals black, between step 1 and 2 of this process, the calculate function butts in and says, nope, we're actually going to filter based on product color equals red. And then that new filter context is passed over to step 2. And then the process continues as it normally would. So now the filter context is for product color where the color equals red, and that passes to any downstream connected table. And we're using the black row here as an example, but it's the same for any other product color that would show up on the rows of that matrix. And then from there, the measure is finally evaluated. And in this case, the quantity sold, which is the sum of the values in the order quantity column from that final filtered sales data table, right? That's what is evaluated. So the point here is that no matter what the initial filter context was in step 1, defined by those matrix row labels, right? Black, multi, silver, etc., regardless of what that is, it's going to get overwritten with red. And then everything from step 2 onward yields the same end result of 4011. And so that's why you see these same repeating values. Again, it's definitely a tricky and pretty technical concept, but let's head back to our report, and we're going to create a function like this so that we can actually see it working for ourselves. All right, so we're back in the report, and first thing I want to do is actually jump to the data quickly. And we're going to be creating a new measure to basically capture our weekend orders. It sounds like our AdventureWorks clients are really interested in sales trends between weekends and weekdays. I don't know, maybe they're looking to see if they need to run more offers on the weekends to promote sales, or if weekends tend to be stronger than weekdays. At any rate, in order to help them answer those types of questions, we're going to use the calculate function to evaluate our orders measure, but only for weekends. We're going to be creating a measure that's based off of this calculated column that we had created. So let's hop back into the report view, right? And then we're going to add a new measure. And we're going to call this weekend orders equals calculate. And one of the other things that I have started to do whenever I'm using the calculate function, again, just to get my mind in the right spot, so I start thinking about this properly, is I always say in a modified filter context when I get to the filter portion of this. So we're going to be evaluating our total orders as part of our expression, right? So we want to calculate total orders in a modified filter context where weekend equals weekend, and close out our parentheses. So I like to kind of say that in my head whenever I'm using a calculate, and it helps me kind of frame what's happening here, right? So I want to calculate my total orders in a modified filter context where the weekend column from my calendar lookup table equals weekend, right? So it's a lot to say, but kind of helpful to work through that in your head. So we're going to lock that in. We can see we have our new weekend orders measure here. We can actually drag this into our matrix. So we're going to update things here a little bit, right? I want to clear out our category name, and I'm going to clear out our quantity sold and our bulk orders. So we're only left with two values here, with two measures, our total orders and our weekend orders. And I'm actually going to quickly jump back and just update that formatting. All right, now we got that comma in there. All right, so we've got our two columns here, right? And just like I showed you in the slide, let's go into our calendar lookup, and we're going to grab that weekend dimension and pull that into our rows. So come down here, calendar, then weekend. And you can see here the same repeating weekend order number over and over and over again, right? For our weekday and weekend values and for our total rows. So now you might be wondering, what's the point of calculating weekend orders when you have access to this weekend field that you can just pull in and break down your orders exactly like we see here? Well, the answer is that if we weren't filtering on this weekend field, right? So if we pull this weekend field out and we add in another field like our category name, we're still able to see the specific weekend orders broken down in a completely different way by our category without having to have that weekend dimension pulled in as well to the matrix view. And not only that, but just like any other measure, this weekend orders measure, it's portable, and it can now serve as an input and be nested into any other calculated measures from here. So it gives me a lot more flexibility than I would have if I were simply just pulling in a dimension like weekend and trying to break down my basic order total measures that way. All right, so that's your primer on the calculate function. In the next few lectures, I'm going to talk about how to make this calculate function even more flexible and even more powerful by nesting other functions like filter and all.